Oh, it looks like we're automatically recording too. In that fun. And so we are live now. Hey, welcome, folks that are hopping in. We'll get started here in the next couple minutes. Hey, welcome, folks that are coming in. So we're gonna give it a couple minutes before we actually start because we are just not at the top of the hour. So we'll give it another 3-5 minutes for folks to kind of come in before we kind of kick things off and get going. If you have questions already though, you should be able to get to the Q&A section, to the Q&A button there at the bottom. Go ahead and feel free to start to throw in answers there. Sorry, answers. Go ahead and start to throw in questions there that you would like answered if you've already got them. Answers only, no questions. We'll come up with the questions, you put in the answers.
In fact, we prefer that.
And hey, as we're basically just waiting for folks to get in, go ahead. I see one question here already. If y'all have questions ahead of time, go ahead and start. Feel free to start putting them in the Q&A. As we get to them, we'll get started here in another minute or two. Alrighty, thanks everybody that is here. We'll go ahead and kind of get started. So as folks are coming in, please feel free to use Q&A to put in questions, and we'll be kind of pulling off that to answer. So to start with, I guess let's do maybe a round of intros for the panelists here. I'll start with me. So I'm Zack. I'm one of the founding engineers here at Tetrate, and one of the Istio steering committee members as well. Weston.
Hey, I'm Weston. Yeah, I'm engineer at Tetrate. Currently working on our kind of control plane features. Previously I've worked in like cloud space as well, DigitalOcean, and some web companies as well.
Yep. So hi everyone, my name is Vikas and I work with Weston on the same team in the service mesh control plane. And previously I was working on Kubernetes and OpenStack and have been working in cloud space since quite some time now. Yep.
Awesome. And thank you all for joining me today. I'm excited about this one. So I think we are, and let me just start off by, I've been a little bit under the weather, so I have a lozenge in my mouth here and I'm coughing a little bit, so excuse me, I'll try and mute. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the first question we have here around is a little bit more general, which is, hey, what are thoughts on Vault? Do we recommend using it as a certificate authority? Is there other interesting things there? And so I think that's a great place to start. So I'll maybe start on that one and then I'll hand off to y'all. But in general, yeah, we see a lot of Vault usage paired with the Istio. The primary way we see it used is to load up the CA certs from Citadel, right? And that is a great use case for it. In general, yeah, we have quite a few companies that have started to use Vault as kind of an intermediate for a lot of their certificates in Kubernetes. And so that if you are doing that, that works very well with Istio, and that's a pretty reasonable strategy, we think.
And just to add to that, in 1.8, there is some cert work done to kind of integrate more with the Caves certificate signing request API. And that just allows like even easier usage with something like Vault as your CA. So yeah, it's good to use.
Yep, and I'll say, even because you asked for some anecdotes as well, anecdotally, we use Vault in some of our own environments to handle secrets there, right? So in like our own staging and test environments, those kinds of things, we use Vault there to handle some of the certs for us. So yeah, so we give a strong rec there. Yeah, and please, if there's more that you want to expand on, go ahead and pop in another question as well. And there is chat as well, if you can drop into as well. Do try and send that to everybody, not just to the attendees, so it's a little bit easier to see, but we'll call it out too. So next one, Helm 3 is added back. Like Istio had Helm support and then it didn't have Helm support. Now it has Helm support again. What do? Is this a good way to install it? What's up? Because do one of y'all want to take that one? Otherwise, I'm happy to.
Yeah, sure. So Helm support now is back again just to support on the upgrade scenarios. This is mainly for the customers who are already using Helm and could not upgrade to Istio operators. So this is basically to facilitate the upgrade path for the old Helm users. And if you are going to do a fresh install in the production for Istio, so then I would think the operators would be the recommended approach.
Yeah, I'll just mirror that, right? So for a couple of different reasons. So first off, I think it's important for people to understand how some of the different Istio installations work. So Istio has used Helm for install since the beginning of time, basically. Even the Istio operator and Istio install, and it's important to understand that those two code bases are identical, right? So the Istio control install command is the Istio operator that runs it's just a different mode of running it. The operator runs live in a cluster. The CLI runs outside the cluster as a one shot, but they're the same code, the same rectification loop that runs when you install it. And under the hood, those actually do materialize a set of Helm charts. And so the introduction of the Istio operator CRD and those kinds of things were an attempt to kind of create an abstraction layer that hid the underlying complexity of Istio's Helm charts so that Istio was freer as a project to go iterate on how the install worked and not break people as we're doing Helm chart things, right? Obviously, there was a kind of a big ask to get Helm back. And so effectively, we are again exposing the underlying Helm charts that the two use, that both the install and the operator use. And so, you do have parity there. You're going to be a little bit less protected from change. That's going to be the big thing. And that's kind of the primary reason, like Vikas said, we wouldn't necessarily recommend doing that. The other big reason is that it's still in an alpha stage in Istio, which means that it's gonna change some. You're right. There might be some better API compatibility down the line, but not yet. Do you know, or do we have customers that are using Istio on virtual machines? How does VMs work? I'll let Vikas or Weston, y'all want to tackle that one? The answer is yes. And there's been a decent bit of work that's been going on to make that happen. Well, y'all want to take it? Okay. Yeah.
Zack,
So yeah. And this is actually one of the things that was made easier in the 1.8 release. So in particular, I think you may have seen some things around the DNS resolution that Istio will do now natively, which was always a big gap in non-Kubernetes environments, right? So Kubernetes, I create a service. Kubernetes sets up all the DNS for me so that the application works seamlessly. That's great. Istio, we have for the entire existence of the project had this issue where service entries in Istio are routable to envoys to things in the mesh, but there was no DNS resolution there. And that was particularly painful in VM environments because effectively you would have to like bridge your VM and your Kubernetes DNS together in a way that you probably didn't want to do. And so now Envoy will actually automatically handle DNS queries and will handle some resolution there on behalf of your application to resolve names that are in the mesh so that things work a little bit more seamlessly. That was one of the bigger pain points around VM usage with Istio, and so that actually has been addressed now in this latest release, which is pretty exciting. But yeah, that's so. Work, and I'm trying to think. There's some other work that actually went in. Vikas, do you want to speak to some of the other VM things?
Yeah, just to add on that, also now in 1.8, this auto registration of the VMs is supported. So that is particularly useful for the cases where load balancers, autoscalers are enabled, and if the VMs are scaling, then it was not feasible before this auto registration to literally go and add work service entries to onboard the VMs. But now after 1.8 and with this auto registration of the virtual machines with the workload group and workload entries, it has become more like pod deployments and the pods. And we would definitely see better adoption of VMs into the service mesh now. Yeah.
Yep. Exactly, and better VM support in Istio has been a long time goal for us.
Yeah, and in 1.9, this like I think this is going to be the beta, the VM support, and this health checking for the workload entry is also coming in 1.9.
Exactly, which will make auto registration even more powerful, as you'll get some of the kind of kube-like functionality there, where Istio is doing a little bit of health checking. You can take VMs out of rotation temporarily without you having to go update the config live in Istio. So it should make it a lot easier to use in kind of a variety of different VM environments without needing a deep integration there.
Exactly. I think it's the first time that it actually the VM support is going to be usable in the usable form in the community.
I was gonna add that, yeah, it does, like, I'm not sure about like which of our customer they're using it as much, but I don't know many that are using it because the support hasn't been great up until now. It's getting much better, and I think it is in a more usable state.
Exactly. One other piece that has been in flight that has been improving incrementally that I think will got some improvements in 1.8, but will continue to get some improvements in 1.9 is the cert issuance to VMs as well. And that's kind of the final gap to close, really, before VMs are kind of fully first-class workloads in the mesh. So it's pretty exciting. And that kind of dovetails right into one of the other questions. I'm going to skip down and take the questions a little bit out of order here. But what is some of the overall goals with Istio, and how do we sell it to higher ups? How would you sell it to higher ups in general? And I think that's a great set of questions. I'll go first, and then I'll let Weston and Vikas go. So I think that there's a couple different things, right? So there's what is the goal for Istio? There's like a couple different answers that I think you'll get depending on who you ask and how old the project is, right? So the answer used to be, the goal of Istio is to operationalize Endpoint. But that's like a very low level, very technical answer, right? Like, yes, that is at the end of the day what Istio does, right? The real long-term goal of Istio is to be able to solve horizontal problems in the networking layer for an organization, right? It is, and this comes out of this idea, companies build software that looks like their company model. And the service mesh architecture came out of Google. They have a very specific way of dealing with production in the SRE team, right? And it is important to know that SREs are mandated to have sublinear growth compared to the growth of the overall engineering organization. So the only way that you can be successful is automation, and by empowering small teams to go enact change on behalf of the entire org. And so that really is where the end state, that's the end goal of Istio, of the service mesh architecture in general, which is to provide this common layer that you can use to deliver horizontal features, right? Features that are cross-cutting across every application. And to be able to pull those out of the set of concerns of an application developer and hand them off to a central team to manage. Maybe they can delegate down to individual teams where they need to, so they're not a bottleneck. And that's some of the controls that you need to put on top of a mesh. But the end goal is to empower your application developers to go build application features because they don't need to worry about these cross-cutting horizontal concerns, and to empower the teams that do care about those things to do them. To maybe give you an example that's like specific, in GCP, we had to ship IAM. Sorry, 1 second here. Lozenge was going on around, I apologize. We had to ship IAM, and that was across every single team in GCP all together, all at the same time. They had to ship 3 different API endpoints for every single resource that all went live at the same day with the same semantics. That was awful. Anytime you've had to coordinate and cat herd across 40 different teams or however many different teams in your organization, you know how hard that is to do. When it came time to do kind of the next rev of that stuff, we had the service mesh in place and we had realized that we could use it for that. And it took a team of 2 people to ship it, right? To kind of ship the next rev, as opposed to having 1 person from 40 different teams work on this and the cross coordination that was required there. And it was more than 1 person for each of the 40 teams, so 1 person reporting in, right? And so that really is the long-term value, and that's how I would go sell it to the higher ups, right? Is look at the kind of force multiplier that it provides, and look at the way that it allows you to build centralized control for things that you care deeply about, things like the security posture of your organization, auditing, visibility, reporting, that kind of stuff. But delegate down to individual developers where you need to, things like routing, traffic management, that kind of stuff. So that's the rough what the goal is and kind of how I would sell it to higher ups. I don't know, Vikas, Weston, anything you want to add there?
I think you pretty much covered
Yeah,
that.
it's pretty extensive, but yeah, maybe just adding like maybe the pieces that allow your developers to be more productive as well, which would be stuff like observability, out of the box support for that, and yeah, with the kind of move to like microservice and such, having like that security on the network layer, just to protect yourself, the security postures like you're mentioning. Yeah, maybe that's what else I would add. But
yep, yeah, makes sense. Perfect.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking like, shall we just go through the 1.8 first big tickets, like what are the big features introduced in 1.8, and then later on come back to the question answers?
Yeah,
So,
yep, sounds good to me.
Let me try.
Do you want to? Can you present? If not, you should be able to.
Yeah, let me try.
You should now be able to present if you could not before. Nope, no, we lost it. And while he's getting that up, yeah, we talked around some of the initial ones. By the way, I don't, if people are not aware, there actually was a point release cut already as well. So there is no longer 1.8. It is 1.8.1 is the most recent version of Istio now. So just FYI. And so for those of y'all following that, do go make sure you update there. I do believe though that 1.8.1 was not a CVE fix. I believe it was a bug fix. So maybe a little bit less urgent than other times. Yeah, Vikas, take us through.
Yeah. So, yeah.
I guess on this first one, we kind of already talked about the Helm 3 support, so could maybe go down a bit.
Yep. One other thing too, people may not be aware of because it came out in the last release, but it is still fairly recent, is the control plane canary. And so there, and you see that that's mentioned a little bit in the installing Istio. But Istio now has a notion of a revision of a control plane deployment and the ability to deploy multiple control planes side by side and incrementally shift traffic to them to make upgrading the control plane a lot easier, a lot safer. So that was one of the big things that was new in 1.7. That does still work in 1.8, of course, and it does work with Helm.
Yeah, so yeah, I was looking for this. Okay, it has been covered in this easier to add VMs. I was looking for the smart DNS proxy thing, which has been introduced in 1.8. So now the sidecar has the DNS information programmed into it by Istio D. So if anything which if any host name which the Istio knows, the request, the DNS queries will not go out of the machines of the pod, and it will be served by the local sidecar. And this helps a lot in the multi-cluster scenarios, and also in the virtual machine use cases. And
Can you scroll down just a little bit there on screen?
yeah, this one I'm talking about. Is it?
Oh, your screen share is not live,
disconnected.
unfortunately. Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Here, I'll let me.
can you?
Yeah, I'll take over from you.
Yeah, yeah. Let me stop sharing.
Here we go. So yeah, like Vikas was talking about, hopefully y'all can see this. Yes.
Yep.
Right. So like we talked about the installing upgrade, great. Multi-cluster is relevant. So I'll come to so VMs, which Vikas was just talking about, in particular, the smart DNS, right?
Yeah.
And auto registration are two big ones there. If y'all are not aware, another thing that was added in 1.7 was this workload entry in WorkloadGroup APIs, which we put in place as groundwork to enable VM support. And so those are two new things that work together with service entry to be able to define individual endpoints in a service much more granularly. We use that for VMs as well. And auto registration takes care of creating those resources on behalf of VMs that are part of the mesh. Multi-cluster support is another one. In particular, we've started to lay out a couple more patterns for running Istio in multi-cluster than have existed previously. In particular, there's now 4 different varieties that are talked about: the multi-primary, the primary remote, multi-primary on different networks, and the primary remote on different networks.
And
which are all yes.
I was just kidding. And those guides for like a different network and single or replicated control plane kind of were there before as well, but now they're just laid out much more nicely and easy to follow.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Exactly. But no, this is some big doc revisions that have happened that hopefully help it make it a little bit clearer how you might start to approach multi-cluster setups. I will say though, just as a word of warning, we don't actually recommend you do any of these 4, which is a little bit of a shame. So one of the things we'll talk about is potentially getting a 5th one up there. Basically, we don't recommend any crosstalk across clusters, and then you orchestrate that with your CI/CD system. We can talk about that at length if people are curious. I think Weston, you talked some about the certificate API work already, didn't you? You want to touch on that a bit?
Yeah. So I guess previously there was like the Istio certificate signing request API, and if you wanted to integrate, you had to implement that. And just because it was less standard, there's less integrations. But yeah, now in this one, there's a standard Kubernetes CSR API integration. So I believe Istio D, when it gets a certificate signing request, it will still like approve it, but then it will leave it up to a third party to sign that CSR, and then that's how you get your certificate. So yeah, it opens like Vault integration, for example, there.
Yep. And this is one, we really strongly recommend that in production deployments, everybody roots Istio in their existing PKI, right? You don't want 2 PKIs. And this is also important. I know people ask about VMs. This is really important for facilitating communication across your new infrastructure that's running in Istio and older things that are running, that are not, things like VMs and bare metal deployments. Those are going to trust out of your existing PKI. You want Istio to use your existing PKI. It's been a barrier to get Citadel that certificate. That's why Vault and things like that are useful. So now you can do this through Kubernetes at the platform layer as well. So makes it hopefully a little bit easier still.
It's like if someone has external CA which is compatible with Kubernetes CSR API, then that can be used transparently for the Istio workload certificates as well. So so if this feature is enabled, the Istio-D will generate the CSR request at the Kubernetes API server, and this external CA can then generate the workload certificate, which the Istio-D will then pass on back to the proxy Istio agent, which has requested the workload certs, and then over the STS, this certificate will be passed on to the envoy.
Exactly. And in that way, Istio can still handle rotation and actually provisioning the credentials, but you still get to control signing with whatever backend signer you're using. One of the other ones, and I'm actually very excited about this one as well. I'm always excited actually about the Istio control stuff that lands. In particular, Bug Report is a great tool for helping us both as like vendors and us as developers on the project actually understand kind of what you're doing, what your setup is, and therefore what is going wrong. So that's a great tool. That one is actually pretty new. One that is not so new is Istio Control Analyze. And if you've been using a recent version of Istio, you've had analysis actually happening via Galley at runtime as well. If you check the status on your Istio objects, you might see errors, for example. Istio Control Analyze runs that outside of the cluster, and it can run it in a bunch of different modes. And so now it shows some better validation errors than we returned before, including things down to stuff like the line number in an object. So that's pretty exciting. And then one final thing that I'll touch on here, or that we'll touch on here before we go back to questions, is that Mixer is gone. This is very sad. Mixer was actually the original piece of Istio that I started to work on. And so that's pretty crazy to see it now sunset, but it's pretty cool to see it have lived out its life and now go away. WebAssembly is the new hotness that'll start over and that will start to replace Mixer, and so that's also pretty exciting. WASM lets us do a lot of really cool stuff, and that's maybe a whole. I think we actually had an AMA on that not too long ago.
Yeah. And I think there is one more worth mentioning enhancement in 1.8, and that is the support for the name in the Istio operator CR. And by doing that, what now is achieved is that it is possible to separate out the upgrade lifecycle of the Istio-D, the control plane, and the gateways. Without this, it was not possible until now to upgrade the control plane, the Istio-D, and the gateway separately, so which was very risky. But now we can have Istio operator CRs, custom resources for particular gateways, specific for the gateways, and gateways can be upgraded independent of the control plane. Very much like the canary upgrade of the control plane, which was introduced in 1.7. So I think this is a very big improvement.
It is, yeah. Thank you for calling that out. That's a big one actually, because that was one of the big warts left over from the control plane canary and that work in 1.7. And so now that loop has kind of been closed, and that whole upgrade story is actually a lot cleaner now, which is phenomenal.
True.
Okay, I'm gonna skip around here on some of the questions. So one of the first ones here is, what's the difference between a virtual service and a destination rule? Is the virtual service governance on client side, governance on destination rules, governance on server side? Yeah, that's roughly correct. I may or may not use governance is the primary word there, but definitely the right mental model to think about is that anything that is in a virtual service in Istio is going to happen on the client side. So things like retries, things like traffic splitting, the rerouting, redirection, those kinds of things, those are going to be implemented by the client side envoy when you're in the mesh, or they're going to be implemented by the ingress proxy for clients that are outside of the mesh, right? The mental model that you should have is that an ingress is your client side sidecar for something that you don't own. In the same way, egress is your server side sidecar for a service you don't own, right? So things that apply at the client side, you can apply out on an ingress gateway. Things that apply server side, you can apply on an egress gateway for outbound traffic. And of course, equally in the mesh where you have sidecars everywhere. Yeah, I'm gonna skip down just a little bit here. So first off, these two kind of go together here. Hey, Istio is changing. How do you recommend staying up to date? And maybe by the same token, hey, is there any word about Istio slowing down release cadence, anything like that? Those are a little bit related. So unfortunately, I think the answer to the second one there, is there any talk about slowing down release cadence? I think that is a no. Unfortunately, not in the upstream project. This is definitely a complaint that we've heard is the rate of change is super high, right? I mean, we just had 1.8 come out, where there's 1.8.1 now. It is challenging to keep up with. One of the big things there that we want to do as a project is to make upgrades less scary, right? That we talked a lot about the control plane canarying and the better install story there. A lot of that is to make it a lot easier to upgrade Istio. One of the other long-term things that we're trying to do is just better API compatibility across releases and things like that. There haven't really been too many breaking changes. There was one in 1.7 that was painful, and that was the Envoy filter API changes. But outside of that, there have not been too many breaking changes on like the networking side of the house, right? The security side of the house went through some churns a couple of releases ago, but is now fairly stable these days, right? So there have been some areas that have been under change. For now, things are relatively static on the API front. Therefore, it should be easier to do upgrades, but that is an overarching goal of the project. So unfortunately, no, there is not plans to slow down the cadence. We are, I will say, Tetrate is looking, we've heard this from our customers, we're looking at things like potentially funding backporting CVE fixes to older versions of Istio for folks that can't upgrade as rapidly. In general, we're kind of hesitant to do that because, again, the overall philosophy that we really want is to forward upgrade and to make upgrades not scary. There's a lot of work there to build the trust to be able to do that, though, of course. So no, this is a pain point that we're aware of, and there's engineering effort being invested into it. But I don't think that we'll be slowing down the release cadence.
For keeping up to date as well, just like what we went through previously, like those release notes are pretty good, and there's usually like an upgrade section as well that will
exactly
try and help you to the best that that doc's abilities can to get through any like breaking changes or whatnot.
And just to drive that home, I'll go back here. I'm back on the release notes. You can see every set of release notes now, every minor version that is released, and major versions too. Obviously, when we cut a new major version, do have both. The announcement as well as the change notes. These are a fine-grained, detailed list of things that were added, updated, and removed, deprecated, as well. And then exactly like Weston said, there are the upgrade notes, right? And these cover some of the specific things that you may or may not need to do for this specific upgrade from 1.7 to 1.8. So both of those are there to try and help kind of capture that, hey, I'm not intimately involved with the project. How do things change? That is what change notes are for, give you the fine-grained detail. The release notes hopefully give you a coarse-grained knowledge, and then ideally the upgrade notes cover those kind of specific pains. Just again, to drive this home, we talked about the Envoy filter syntax change being a painful API break in the 1.7 release. That was specifically called out in the upgrade notes with some advice on how you would handle that, for example. Alrighty, let's keep on churning through questions here. So when using the sidecar resource, this was, if by the way, if, as an aside, if I'm going to nominate worst names in Istio APIs, and I feel at least marginally qualified to do that because I helped design a decent swap of them. Sidecar was a bad name that we picked, I'm sorry. So the sidecar resource, I will always try and talk about that as the sidecar API resource, right? In contrast to sidecar envoys, which are a deployment. So the sidecar API resource, customized listeners, not delivered to Envoy. Any troubleshooting ideas? Probably. There's a couple different things there to look at. One, make sure that you're looking at the bootstrap configuration. For one, I believe that some of the changes you can do there would manifest in the bootstrap listeners. Otherwise, it could be that you have some error somewhere in there. So I would check Istio control analyze as well to see. Generally speaking, we have not. Oh, and then make sure if you're setting addresses on the sidecar, it is literally only 127.0.0.1 is the only IP address that is supported. So if you are setting addresses, you can only use exactly that IP address plus any port that you want, or you can use a Unix domain socket and only those two things, and not anything else there for the addresses. So those are maybe that's the most common error that we would see that isn't necessarily caught, but won't manifest. Otherwise, look at your bootstrap config, do proxy control, Istio control proxy config listeners to check out the listeners that are loaded there. By the way, the listeners these days are annotated with the Istio configuration that came from, so you can use that to help debug. I think in that same vein, somebody asked, besides Istio control bug support, are there other good resources for Istio debugging? Y'all want to share kind of some of what y'all do for Istio debugging?
Yeah, there's a lot of Istio Kettle besides bug report commands that help quite a bit. Yeah, there's like proxy config, proxy status. So proxy status tells you basically if what the state of the control plane is in terms of syncing data with the proxies. So you can see like maybe like and this kind of goes into Envoy terms a little bit. But if my like listener is or clusters, which is the backend, yeah, if those are like properly getting sunk up with my proxies. And then proxy config, super helpful in seeing like the current setup of an individual proxy. So I can see like what listeners are there, kind of, yeah, what IPs and ports it's listening on, what routes does it have, what clusters does it have, kind of like what does it, like what other services does it know about to send traffic to. And those are some things I look at quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah, and actually one of the things that was improved very recently with the proxy config commands is that their summary views are a lot more valuable these days because the summary actually outputs things like what virtual service created this route, right? What gateways created this listener, that kind of stuff. So it is a lot more helpful now for debugging than it used to be. So there's a lot of great tooling there. There's additionally, I think there's some blog posts that different people have written up. I've certainly written up a blog post that's on the Tetrate site. We can probably link after that is kind of my checklist for Istio debugging, kind of the steps that I go through for any generic Istio problem. I think that there's been some that have been posted even on the Istio blog as well. So maybe we can link some of those afterwards in some of the summary.
I will say too, it requires understanding Envoy a bit more, but in a pinch, you can also output to like JSON for the proxy config and then see like pretty much an exact dump of the actual config. And yeah, the proxy config info is a lot better now, but sometimes it's still nice to just see exactly what Envoy is pretty much getting and debug that way.
Yep.
Sidecar injection increases network delay between services, reduce it. So it's a little bit hard to say without knowing your full kind of specific story here, but certainly always adding a sidecar is going to make things a little slower. There are some things that you can do to reduce that penalty. So one of the single biggest things that you could do is stop using IP tables interception and update your application to use a Unix domain socket, for example, between Envoy and the application, and that'll shift out quite a bit of the network stack and things. You'll get better latency there. No, I would love to kind of hear more about some of the pain there, or like what kind of latencies you're seeing. One of the other things too, I'll just call out is the for every release that we run, there are performance evaluations that are run in Istio upstream, and those are published on the site. I'll dig up the link in just a second here and post it. They go over what are the reasonable delays that you would expect across quite a few different percentiles when you are using Istio. So the other thing I'd recommend is go look at that, make sure your numbers are in line with those numbers. If they're not, something is fishy. If they are, you're in normal kind of operating mode, that's fine. If that's still too high latency, there are things you can do. There's Envoy parameters you can tune, some of the startup sizing, buffering, that kind of thing. You can use Unix domain sockets to skip out on some of the network and kernel latency that you would get otherwise.
Yeah, and this is like still like performance in the data path is still like very much being actively worked on. I recently saw like an RFC where someone was proposing something around like eBPF and kind of using splicing in the kernel to reduce the number of copies for data on connections. So like, yeah, that should also continue to just keep getting better.
And
Exactly.
also integrations with the fast paths and user space networking like DPDK. So that in the telecom industry, that integration is also being happening. If someone is really sensitive to delays.
Yep. Yeah. And so, so today there's not a ton of great stuff, but exactly there is experimental work with DPDK fork of Envoy that's actively happening, for example. Exactly like Weston said, another angle that folks are looking at is XDP, Express Data Path, and therefore eBPF, and offloading Envoy functionality there as well to speed things up. So there's a lot of really novel work going on. There's also, I'll point out, there's just continues to be just the good old elbow grease work of just like make the C++ code run faster as well in the Envoy code base, which is always ongoing.
I'd like to hear Zack answer this one. If you could rename sidecars, what would you call them?
Oh gosh, yeah. Honestly, they're like config scope, but like that's not a good name either. Naming is the hardest thing in computer science, right? And so naming caching it off by one, and Istio gets all of those. So yeah, it's a tough name. I just would not reuse a name that is already a name that we have. don't call two different things
at least
the same thing.
Some different name, at least
Exactly.
like sidecar config, at least minimum.
Exactly. It's confusing. Names are important, and it's confusing to have duplicate names. As maybe the biggest summary, the shortest summary I can give for why sidecar is a bad name. So one, there aren't many multi-cluster installation methods on the Istio website. I actually think there's probably too many. What is the best approach? Vikas, Weston, why don't y'all take that away? Because y'all have implemented things around our best approach.
Yeah, so best approach definitely would not be to expose the complete Kubernetes API server or complete internal service of a cluster to the remote clusters. So definitely this is not the best approach, which is being recommended in multiple ways at the upstream Istio, unfortunately. So in the best approach, it should be behind the gateways and it should be very controlled way in which we are exposing services to be consumed by remote clusters, in short.
So yeah, just to expand on that a little bit, what is like the recommended deployment topology that we want? And that is, and I'm sorry, there's sirens outside. That is an independent Istio control plane in each cluster, isolated from each other. That way, and the importance there is aligning your failure domains, right? So your Kubernetes cluster represents a couple different failure domains within your infrastructure. It represents a compute scheduling failure domain. It represents a configuration failure domain because many different elements pull configuration from that Kube API server. And so we want to align Istio to those. And we don't want to cross couple them. Therefore, you want an Istio control plane that talks to exactly one cluster is what we would argue is the best thing. And then, but you do need something to manage the coordination of these islands, right? And that's where there are many different solutions, right? That's where things like CI/CD can be a reasonable solution, right? Using your CD system to keep and something like Git as source of truth to keep your clusters up to date with each other. We've gone and built software to do some of the synchronizing, right? And this actually gets into some of the other aspects of how we would recommend multi-cluster deployments. The other big element of exposing of having Istio talk to a remote Kube API server is that you're getting all the endpoint data there. You don't need that data, and that is the highest rate of change data in the entire system, right? Endpoint change is the highest rate of change stuff. Pilot, like inside the Istio code base, we literally have fast paths for handling endpoint change because that dominates all the other change that happens in the system. It's not even close. And so you want to avoid this n-squared endpoint propagation problem, right? Where I have, in Kubernetes clusters, I don't want them to all gossip anytime anyone schedules a pod, right? That's what we want to avoid.
And in reality, like there can be like hundreds of clusters, and this is not feasible at all to have all API servers watching each other and talking to each other, all configurations being exchanged.
So we wouldn't recommend you have hundreds of clusters, but we do have customers that do, right? That is that's an easy boundary for tenancy, for example, right? And you want your mesh to align with that. You want separate, but then you have to coordinate. Right.
Each team have like strict control on what they want to expose and what they don't want to expose. So this is also a concern that teams may not want because of the security concerns. They don't want to open all the services to remote clusters.
Exactly. And so what we recommend then is that you take a more internet-like approach. And we actually, talking about names of things, we picked the name Gateway for Istio load balancer deployments very specifically. And what we recommend is you set up something very much like BGP, right? So how does the internet work? I know things on my local network, and I know the gateway to get to the remote network, right? And that's how we recommend you run Istio, which is to say, for cross-cluster communication, send it through a gateway
similar to BGP.
the remote. Exactly, to the remote cluster, and let it do the load balancing there into the destination. And in that way, you can have seamless traffic that flows internally and externally. You can still get all the normal Istio goodness around client-side load balancing, locality aware about load balancing, all that stuff. But you can avoid some of the configuration propagation problems, which are part that just don't scale.
Yeah.
I'll skip the Istio versus Linkerd. I think I think most of the pros and cons there can be chalked up to Envoy, right? So look at the functionality in the data planes there. If Linkerd has all the functionality that you need, then that might be a good simple option. Chances are that you want things that it doesn't have, in which case Istio is probably the best pick of the Envoy service meshes.
And just another quick point, like I think first class support for like VMs is just a little further along in Istio there.
Well, I think it's explicitly out of scope for Linkerd even, right? Yeah. I think Linkerd is chosen their scope specifically to be Kubernetes. Yeah. Now maybe that's if I'm wrong, William can tweet at me. But So I think that's another big aspect, right? Is that's great if you're Kubernetes only. That's great. I don't know of any large company that's Kubernetes only. I don't know of most small companies that are Kubernetes only, to be honest. How do you handle high availability ingresses? You want to talk on that one?
Weston, you want to take
Yeah,
that?
just reading this question a little bit.
I think client side retries can help in there.
Yeah, so you could, I'm trying to read this question. So if your ingress gateway hangs or dies and a request fails, yeah, I think what just Vikas was saying, like a client-side retry in that case would be the best. Like you can run multiple gateways, so you could have like multiple instances of it running. But yeah, if one dies, like just having those like client-side retries could save you in situations like that.
Yeah, I think the question is if there is a connection, ongoing connection, and the gateway port dies, then how to handle that gracefully.
Yeah, and unfortunately today there's not great solutions to that. So this really gets into the idea of being an edge load balancer, right?
Yeah.
And when we look at like Kubernetes ingress, for example, that really does not handle edge load balancing concerns, full stop, right? If you look at cloud provider deployments, you actually do have that load balancer outside of ingress, right? And that is handling basically L4 load balancing, if you will. It's a little bit more sophisticated than that, into a set of envoys that handle things at L7, right? If you're, for example, on-prem and you don't have that cloud provider load balancer in front, then yeah, very often, if you're bridging between like VMs and into Kubernetes, you need something there, whether that's an F5 that's doing it. You can use things like Calico to do BGP magic to have requests land at the right spots too. There's a lot of different ways that you can implement that low-level load balancing. But you do, at the end of the day, if you're using Envoy as like a Kubernetes ingress, you do have to facilitate the load balancing into that ingress deployment. That's not a solved problem, unfortunately. I can recommend there's a bunch of projects to look at to facilitate that. There's Catran from Facebook, is battle tested, used in production, well vetted. There are things like GitHub Load Balancer, GLB, is a relatively new project out of GitHub that handles the L4 load balancing in eBPF, if I'm not mistaken, using the express state of XDP to do some of the cool load balancing stuff there into a set of L7 proxies. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about the software load balancing edge, you do have to have 2 layers of load balancer there to have a highly available system. You need a tier that is handling that's stateless and handling L4, and then you need a tier that's handling some of the L7 concerns to facilitate software load balancing at the edge.
Yeah. So this one, like external traffic can enter either from the Istio ingress gateway or the ingress of the service. What is the difference between the two? Why does Istio need to add an additional gateway such as ingress? I think he or she is asking about the Istio ingress gateway, which gets created in the Istio system namespace, and the gateways which are created in the application namespace. So that's not needed for the application networking, the one which is in the Istio system. But a gateway we need sometimes in the Istio system namespace if we want to expose the control plane services for things like VMs and communication from the VMs. So in that case, we need a specific gateway for the control plane in the Istio system namespace. Otherwise, if that is not the use case, it can be totally removed and applications can be accessed through the application or the service gateway, which are there in their specific namespaces.
And let me be clear here. So like, because it sounds like talking about ingress for the service, you're deploying an ingress proxy. So it's important to remember that when we talk about like a Kubernetes ingress, that actually gets implemented with a physical deployed proxy, right? So it's not just that you write an ingress resource and traffic flows to your service, right? You're deploying an Nginx or an HA proxy.
Some implementation is required.
Exactly. You're deploying some proxy somewhere that is handling that traffic. So it's not that Istio needs an additional one. It's that you can use Istio instead of that ingress, right?
Yeah.
Now, Istio's ingress service, the Istio ingress gateway, that's just a default one that's deployed. You can deploy your own with any arbitrary names, and they don't have to be shared. You can deploy your own per application if you want, and we actually recommend that. Especially if you're getting started, that you don't use the shared Istio ingress gateway, the default one, but instead create one for individual teams so that they're not, and create a separate deployment for them so they're not going to cause outages for each other. It's going to make your life easier. Once you get confident with operating the system, start to merge your envoys, your ingresses back together, and you can get better efficiency.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then maybe there's the kind of related question of, like, and the other answer to that question, why does Istio need another, like, the other half of that is the ingress L4 stuff that we talked about, right? So there's always a cloud load balancer in front that's implementing the Kubernetes load balancer service behavior, and then Istio is going to sit behind that. That's the case, again, even if you're using an Nginx or HA proxy, that kind of thing. Yeah.
And this, what is upcoming in 1.9? Weston, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. Kubernetes has been working on like multi-cluster support in their APIs, and I believe there's some work going on to support this in Istio as well. So to register in Istio service registry, make that aligned with what's available in the Kubernetes API. Mm-hmm. And if you're not familiar with the Kubernetes API, it just basically allows you to specify like which services you want exported to other clusters. VM health checks is another one for workload entries, I guess.
And I think with the now that the WASM support is already merged in the master, Envoy master, there will be work to convert static filters to the WASM based filters. There will be some focus on that.
Alrighty, so last question. Well, there's 2 questions left. Swag for sure. We're looking forward to getting back into physical conferences once the world is healthy again. It'll be super fun. And yeah, the Tetrate branded stuff will be good. Around startup sequence, this is actually one that comes up a ton that we hear a lot of pain about from customers, right? And not just customers, but users of the project as well. This whole, hey, Envoy at startup races my container at startup, things were failing. I was literally on a customer call debugging this Friday, right? Somebody it turned out that, they thought they were having database connectivity issues. It turns out, no, it's just that your app immediately starts up and tries to connect the database and it beats Envoy. And so this is a general problem. The real deep solution is platform support for a sidecar in Kubernetes, for example, where it starts it up first and then it starts up the application, and when things tear down, it tears them down in the reverse order. That unfortunately is on hold on the upstream project. It's not being actively developed right now, as far as I know. And so instead, what I would recommend, there's a couple different tools that have been made by a couple different users of Istio. I believe Monzo has one, but the one that I'm more familiar with is from Redbox, which is a tool called Scuttle. And that's there on their GitHub repo. I'll link it as well, but it's Redbox LLC/Scuttle on GitHub. And that's a tool that you can actually use to wrap your application, and it is Istio aware. So what you go and do is, in your Docker file, you take your existing entry point and you prefix it with the Scuttle binary, and of course you include Scuttle in your Docker build. And it pulls the Envoy's readiness endpoint. So Envoy, the sidecar, exposes a readiness endpoint. That Scuttle starts up concurrent with Envoy. It pulls Envoy's readiness endpoint locally, and then only after Envoy is ready does it start up your application. Then on the flip side, when you're running a Kubernetes job and the application closes, shuts down, then Scuttle will shut down the application as well. And so that's an incredibly useful tool for addressing those lifecycle mismatches in the platform. And so I would recommend that one. We have some customers that are using it. There, like I said, though, there's multiple. Monzo has one as well. I can't remember the GitHub repo right offhand. This is something that I'm actually kind of pushing for us to pull into Istio project proper. Basically, I want us to pick one and at least migrate it into the Istio ecosystem repo, but potentially even into the Istio org as kind of our blessed way of doing it until this is solved at the platform layer. That hasn't happened yet, but that kind of tooling is what I would recommend. And with that, I think we're all questioned out. So thank you all a ton. Let me get that link there. But thank you everybody for taking the time and joining us today. Hopefully this was useful. You all got some questions answered. If y'all have any other things that you're curious about that you didn't get to ask, feel free to follow up in email after the fact. But with that, thank y'all, and everybody have a wonderful day, morning, evening, night, wherever it is for you.
See ya.
See you. Bye.